Let me start by saying I don't think any of the writers behind the Injustice universe are pushing some sinister agenda intentionally. I think more than anything, the writing is driven by wouldn't it be cool if superheroes fought each other mentality, rather than any worse intention. Still, sometimes even accidentally, your story ends up looking a little questionable, so it's worth discussing all the same. So, Injustice is a very successful franchise, with 2 high-selling console games, successful mobile spin-offs, years of comic book adaptations, an arcade version, and an, as of recording, upcoming animated film. The story relies on one main conceit, a DC universe very similar to the ones we recognize, especially resembling New Earth, Prime Earth, and the DCAU, went a different direction when Superman killed the Joker after he committed genocide, thus turning Superman evil, and he becomes a totalitarian dictator. I talked briefly before in my video on the various evil versions of Superman why this falls a little flat, at least for me. There isn't a great reason for this to move a supposedly moral person to the point of complete immorality. Some argue that the prequel comics explain it better as a series of events leading to his downfall, but in the span of a few months in that story, he goes from the typical Superman to committing genocide himself. It doesn't line up logically, but it's mainly, again, just an excuse to get to the main event, smashing action figures together simulator. But what is concerning is how the battle lines between established DC characters fall. Why is Batman, for example, on the side of good, while Superman and Wonder Woman are on the side of evil? You could easily argue it's because Batman is incredibly popular, but since when has that stopped the conversion? Justice Lords, Crime Syndicate, the Dark Multiverse all have kept the Trinity evil across. Making Batman the good one and Superman and Wonder Woman the bad ones is an interesting choice to say the least. In the case of Superman and Batman, who are so similar, what is it about Superman that makes him more suited for the role of evil? Some argue that Superman is often set as the immoral rival to Batman to reflect the concept that those born with power are less likely to know how to morally use it. But Batman himself was just as born to power as Superman. His money primarily comes from the wealth of his parents. Some argue Superman is less popular than Batman, and that may be fair. DC certainly seems to think so, and while it varies depending on which audience we're considering, that could be the case. Some argue that Superman represents the privileged, but honestly, again, billionaire. One thing I briefly brought up in my video about the various evil versions of Superman is that there is the potential to read these 2 men whose similarities are numerous, from power to looks to initial honor and so on, if only one is portrayed as corrupt and evil, and that one is the undocumented immigrant, to view this as, well, suggesting something less savory. When there are 2 seemingly similar men, and the biggest difference between the 2, aside from one turning into an evil overlord, is that one is a natural-born citizen and the other came to the country as a child, it can create the inference that it is the immigration itself that is suspect. Of course, there is also the fact that Clark comes from a working-class background and is employed in a working-class level job, whereas Bruce has always been wealthy, adding in potential classism to potential xenophobia. That is, admittedly, not something you couldn't just chalk up to coincidence, so I would need to look at the further included characters before saying there is any meaning in this dichotomy. On the side of the regime, Injustice Superman's evil authoritarian empire is Wonder Woman, Damian Wayne's Nightwing, and Black Adam, all 3 of whom are Middle Eastern or North African immigrants. Themyscira, actually being Turkish, isn't usually common knowledge, but even if we ignore that, we still have Damian and Adam as Middle Eastern and North African men who come to the United States that end up joining a cabal of embedded individuals that overthrow the US government and replace it with their own authoritarian regime. Again, not great. The regime is also allied with Aquaman, who lives in Atlantis, not the US, but still keeps with the theme of don't trust foreigners. That's not even getting into the Polynesian-inspired tattoo they gave him in the sequel. Or Hawkgirl, an extraterrestrial immigrant like Superman that's coded as Middle Eastern. Raven, Doomsday, and Sinestro are all immigrants as well. By the time of the sequel, the only member of the regime, an organization which, though global, began in the United States and is run in the United States in defiance of the old US government, who was born in the United States, is Cyborg, a black disabled man. Meanwhile, the insurgency, which is meant to represent good and is interested in returning freedom to the governments of the world, is composed entirely of US citizens, save one whom we'll address in a second. Looking out for the good of humanity are 3 multi-billionaires, an accomplice to genocide, a serial killer, and Black Canary, who takes the place of Sandra Hawk in this universe. But hey, it's not just white people. The sequel adds in Blue Beetle and Firestorm, 2 plucky sidekicks / subordinates / comic relief, still US-born citizens. After all, I feel like this is much more of a question about nationality than about race. Now, if you're only familiar with the first game, you might say to yourself, weren't there a few more US citizens on the side of the regime? And there were in the first game. Billy Batson, a kid who trusted the immigrants until he was murdered by them when he disagreed with them. Barry Allen, a cop and gun freedom activist who is redeemed when he comes to his senses and joins Team America First. And Hal Jordan, military man that abandoned his military to join the regime, but is allowed back into the military and forgiven as long as he too joins Team America First. Never mind him leading to the death of several Green Lanterns, never mind both of them being willing, consenting participants in the acts of authoritarianism enacted by Superman. Catwoman, too, who was part of the regime, is again allowed to join Team America First. And I'm not saying that in-universe these guys are wrong. I'm saying that the questionable aspects of it represent less questionable actions in the real world. But, like I said, there is one immigrant that is part of Batman's team, Supergirl. The immigrants with darker skin and dark hair are uniformly on the side of evil. The blonde-haired, blue-eyed immigrant is the sole exception to the otherwise rule that immigrants in the Injustice universe are not to be trusted. Take them in, treat them well, like your family, even adopt them, and they'll eventually turn on you, make you sorry you trusted them. They were never trustworthy. Except for the one that looks like Eurocentric propaganda. In case viewers aren't aware, there's a demonstrated trend of America Firsters being, on the surface, opposed to immigration on the argument of defending a national identity, not a racial or ethnic one, and that is the case for some people. However, many of these people, including the United States' 45th president, are often much more opposed to immigrants of color than white immigrants, encouraging immigration from Western European countries while demonizing immigration from pretty much anywhere else in the world. Obviously, Kara isn't European, but these people don't want European immigrants because of geography, but because of physical appearances. So, if the good guys are all natural-born US Americans, save one immigrant that is blonde-haired and blue-eyed, and the bad guys are all immigrants to the US, save one natural-born disabled black man, it is a bad look, even if it's not intended. And honestly, I personally don't think that Netherrealm strikes me as the type of company to intentionally create this paradigm. If you probably asked most of the people there, they would say that their company is a progressive one. But there are multiple YouTubers who have amassed large followings just by complaining about their storytelling incompetence for a good reason. The bad guys in this story are somehow dictators of the entire world, whose empire falls almost as immediately as the chief dictator gets his butt kicked for the 50th time in the story, because the prequel comic repeatedly has Superman be curb-stomped by people he should easily handle, because the storytellers don't know how to scale rising action or let you know that a character is wrong without having them beat up. It's not like it's a believable parallel to real life, or even a well-told story, so there being some things that don't quite add up isn't unsurprising. However, this story still is about a group of immigrants taking over the United States government and eventually the world. So even if it's not intended to be xenophobic, it's tone deaf. Just like it's tone deaf to say, if you pay extra money, you can play as one of DC's 3 most important heroes who have been painted over a pre-existing fighter. Just like it was tone deaf for them to celebrate Pride Month by encouraging players to beat up an explicitly queer character. Just like it was tone deaf to make the Society of Gorillas flag take design inspiration from the Pan-African flag and the flag of Mozambique. Just like it was tone deaf to take perhaps the most iconic feminist in US media and turn her into, quote, Superman's rebound girl, end quote. Yes, all of those are serious, literal examples. Mind you, I've spoken on Netherrealm before, specifically with their character Nightwolf, whom they claimed was made to avoid Native American stereotypes, and yet still to this day is a mockery and exploitation of Lakota culture for their own money. While I doubt the intention is bad, at least internally, that doesn't really matter too much when we talk about the final product. And the final product suggests that immigrants, who in the real world are less likely to commit crimes, are more likely to be dangerous than natural-born citizens, and thus you should treat them with distrust or at least apprehension. This narrative is xenophobic and deserves to be criticized as such.